doing? What if I had to go through life like this? What if you had to go through life like this? Being chained up. It was just hard enough for me to walk up here, and you guys know I'm handicapped. It was hard enough for me to walk up here and just put stuff down. What if we had to go through life like that? On the surface, it doesn't seem too bad, but over time, it kind of gets in the way. There's some things that being in bondage and things that being chained up cause us to not be able to enjoy and not be able to experience. It doesn't seem too bad, but you ever stop and thought about how wonderful it is to hug your kids or a friend? Maybe just drive down the road without wrecking. It's a silly illustration, but sadly today, slavery in the world is alive and well. Sadly today, slavery is thriving like never before. You say, Sam, well, I thought that was abolished. I thought that it's no longer allowed. There's a slavery known today as human trafficking, isn't there? This isn't the greatest slide I could give you. It's kind of blurry, but those are all the reasons, or some of the reasons, I should say, that human trafficking exists. 27 million people affected annually by human slavery. Lives are destroyed. Families are torn apart, never to see one another again. Maybe caused because of trauma. Maybe there was sexual abuse in the family. Maybe corruption exists. Maybe there just seemed like there was no purpose for you. Maybe someone was in debt and said, well, I'm going to go sell myself to get out of this debt. Human trafficking is a challenge. Oh, that something could be done to stop this tragedy. And lest you think that my message today is on human trafficking, it's not, but it does have bearing on what I'm about to say. Don't you know that there are parents everywhere, family members everywhere that are hoping, that are praying, that are searching that their family members would be found and that they would be returned and restored and rescued? My friends, I'm telling you, it's everywhere, worldwide. Yet, there's an even more staggering number than 27 million in slavery each day. John 8:34, Jesus tells us this. You'll see it on the slide. Everyone who commits sin is a slave to sin. Everyone who commits sin is shackled in sin's bondage, unable to get free. And that seems like bad news, doesn't it? That seems like a bad problem. Human trafficking, horrible. Buying and selling of people to accomplish what you want, what the world wants, horrible. But this human slavery thing takes on a different turn and a different view when we understand that Jesus was true in what he said, that every one of us who commits sin is a slave to sin. Paul said in the book of Romans that all have sinned and fall short of God's standard, the glory of God. And I don't know about you, but the word all means every one of us. You go, well, I'm not a sinner. I understand that you might think that. I understand that you might think that your life is rosy and perfect, but I must tell you the truth because God has challenged me and charged me to tell you the truth, that the truth is, whether you believe it or not, it's true. Every one of us has sinned. Every one of us falls short of God's glory, falls short of God's standard. And because every one of us has sinned, we are a slave to sin. The challenging thing is the payment for sin is death. You see, 7 billion globally are affected by this sin. That's the population of the world today, a little over 7 billion people. Not 27 million in human trafficking, and by the way, that's a tragedy. 7 billion of us, and counting, are affected by the challenge of sin. We are slaves to sin. But Jesus provides the solution, He doesn't just leave us hanging, that every one of us who commits a sin is a slave to sin. He doesn't just leave us hanging that the wages of sin is death. Oh, but Paul goes on to tell us, but the gift of God is eternal life. Jesus himself said, so if the Son makes you free, you will be free indeed. Let me ask you today, has the Son set you free? Not the S-U-N, the S-O-N. Has the Son set you free? In our Love Like Jesus series that we're going through, we began to embrace the fact that Jesus told us that the world out there, our friends, our family, our co-workers, even people in here, as they come in our doors looking for hope, looking for encouragement, looking for a place to belong, Jesus said, if you want them to know that you're my disciples, you'll love one another like I have loved you. So we've been unpacking the love of Jesus over the last several weeks on this journey to Easter. How did Jesus show his love for us? We saw that there was serving love as he washed the disciples' feet. There was healing love as he healed the man at the pool of Bethesda. There was compassionate love. There was confronting love as we looked last week with the woman caught in adultery. And I hope every one of you still have your rock with the question marks on it. And I hope you look as you catch it in your eye and you remember that Jesus has confronted us to love others like he loved us. But today I want us to understand that he's loved us with redeeming love. We are stuck in bondage of sin and we can't get out of it. You can't be good enough to unsin yourself. You can't pay enough money to get the sin out of your life. You can't do enough good at the church and work here and be a deacon and be a this, be a pastor to get sin out of your life. There's nothing that you and I can do to redeem ourselves from the curse that's on us and the other 7 billion people that exist in the world today. But Jesus brings to us a redeeming love. A love that we ought to have one with another. That redeeming love tells us something about who he was, because Jesus came to liberate us. Jesus came to free us. Jesus came to rescue us from the bondage of slavery that isn't found in chains and locks, but it's found in the human heart, where we want to do better and we want to do better, and yet we find ourselves with the inability to do better. We have no strength, we have no power, because the Spirit doesn't live in us. We are slaves to sin. And Jesus came and loved us with redeeming love, and he came to purchase our freedom, to be our Redeemer. That's what redeem means. To buy back, to liberate, to rescue, to free from bondage. And only Jesus has the ability and the checkbook to buy back our freedom. Reminds me of a story in the Old Testament, the book of Ruth, of a young lady whose life epitomizes that of you and I, that of just a normal, everyday sinner, a young lady that needed to be rescued, because we all need the redeeming love of Jesus, don't we? Let's look at that young lady in the book of Ruth. Early in your Bible, right? Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, Ruth. Did you get that? You can find it. Use that table of contents in front. It's okay. We're going to be in Ruth today, and I'll point out, this is a 4-chapter book. I'll point out some text as we go along. You don't necessarily need to follow that, but let me set the story for you. Let me let you know what's going down so that we can paint the picture of where we find ourselves in the Old Testament. The story begins in the land of Judah. All right? The land of Judah was Bethlehem and that area right there. The story begins in the land of Judah. It was a time during the Judges. All right? If you know anything about the nation of Israel, God placed judges in place to bring about direction for the people. And Israel at this time was experiencing a terrible famine. And we really can't relate to famine so much here. We're a church that we alternate now with the First Assembly. We used to alternate with Green Valley, but every other month during the school year, we have a backpack program, and we're up to 200 backpacks every week that we build and send out to the schools to help kids that are dealing with their own little personal famine at home. It's a beautiful ministry. Vita McPeak runs our ministry along with Dee McCaffrey from afar, but they together run our ministry here, and we've just handed that over to First Assembly, and we'll start back up in August doing the same thing. I hope you'll contribute to that, because famine is real, so we can't really understand it here, because I don't know about you, but I've been eating right lately, right? And yet these people were struggling with famine. This guy named Elimelech and his wife Naomi, Mama Nay, and her two sons, Mahlon and Chilion. I just can't say the word Mahlon without thinking about barbecue. I don't know why. Man. They leave Bethlehem because the famine is so bad. Now you can kind of use this stained glass window up here to picture that's the Dead Sea, if you will. Everything that's colored and beautiful, that's the Dead Sea. And over here, kind of just below that little piece of trim, is Bethlehem and Jerusalem and that region. And so here's where they are in Judah, and they leave Bethlehem, and they make this trek up around the northern side of the Red Sea, and they cross along, and then they get over here about halfway into the country, and they start working their way down into this city of Moab. Or this region of Moab. They made this trek to find sustainable food. Now, Moab was named after a son from a guy named Lot. Y'all remember Lot, right? Remember his wife? She turned into what? Pillar of salt. There's a speculation that he had her turn back and look, but I don't think so. All right, I think she just was connected to the world. Lot was Abraham's nephew, wasn't he? And I want you to see the providential hand of God. God called Abraham to leave and to start this new nation of his own people. And Lot chose to go with him. And Abraham says, okay, so connect the dots here. Here we find Lot. That mess went on. Sodom and Gomorrah. His wife gets turned into a pillar of salt. His daughters decide to take matters into their own hands. And without going into great detail, Lot is able to have a son through one of his daughters. A very sick and tragic decision made there. And that son is named Moab, and this land is named after him. So you can understand the Moabites were a culture that weren't quite right. Okay, they worshipped a god called Chemosh, and this god was a pagan god. Among other gods that they worshipped, that was their primary god. And this culture of Moab over here epitomized everything that Israel wasn't. You stop and think about, you're a pretty good productive citizen, and you pay your taxes, and you come to church, and you believe in Jehovah God, and you embrace conservative tradition. Well, don't picture something that's totally opposite of that, whatever you might think it might be. Whatever TV show you think that embraces, right? Whether it be Swamp People or Ink Master or whatever, right? You picture whatever you think is the opposite of the way you believe, that's Moab. It was messed up. And that's where they go to find some groceries. All right? So here's the challenge. Moab and the Israelites, the Moabites and the Israelites were enemies. All right? That goes way back. But times were desperate for my man Elimelech and his family, Naomi, Mahlon, and Chilion. So they make this trek over here to Moab to get some groceries. And I want you to know that God had a plan. God had a plan. He's going to use even the nasty, pagan-worshiping culture of Moab to affect his plan should be a tip for you and I, that the people you see on the street may be just instruments in God's hand for you to reach them so that they can reach someone else, so that we can see the kingdom of God grow and grow and grow. So don't judge them. Don't put your stamp of judgment on people that aren't like you and aren't in your Jesus box. Love them like Jesus would, with a redeeming love. So God has a plan, and while they're in Moab, and I don't know the time frame left and right that they were in Moab was like 10 years. But during this time frame, early on, Elimelech, Naomi's husband, dies. So here she is, widow, with her 2 boys. Now they're growing up, they're approaching adulthood, but they're in the land of what? Moab. Not Judah, not their homeland. They're in the land of the enemy, the pagan worshiping land of the enemy. But Mahlon and Chilion, they've been checking out the ladies at the market. They've been seeing some people that they might ought to ask for their hand in marriage. Can you imagine Naomi? Oh, I don't want my sons marrying those girls. Y'all got some of those? He better not bring home her. She better not bring that guy home. And it was just as real for them. The big deal was their pagan culture. Naomi didn't want Mahlon and Chilion marrying into this pagan culture, because have you known this, students? You know this to be true at school. The kids that are doing the ornery have a greater influence on the kids that are trying to follow the straight line than the kids that are following the straight line have on the kids that are doing the ornery. And y'all just fill in the blanks, right? It happens. There was no one that ever motivated me in school to be a better kid. But man, I had some great mentors in orneriness. I really did. I would hop on the bus with them. That's what happened in that time frame. So Naomi was a little bit skeptical. So Mahlon and Chilion, they find some girls here. The boys have grown up and they marry women from this God's forsaken country. Pagans. And the boys could possibly be swayed and turned away to foreign gods. It takes a strong faith, my friends, to influence others, which is why we want you to grow your faith and your walk with God. Mahlon marries this cute little girl, Ruthie Joe. Her name's Ruth. Ruth's name in Hebrew means friendship. That's a pretty good girl to marry, wouldn't you say? I married a girl. She's a friend. She's a friend, man. Now, my boy Chilion, he marries a girl named Orpah. Not Oprah. She came later. He marries a girl named Orpah. Now, this girl, her name meant stubborn. Bad choice, Chilion. Right? Who would marry a stubborn woman? Don't say it, men. So that's the situation that's going on. Dad dies, boys marry women, everything is cruising along. Now, during this situation, Mamane, who lost her husband Elimelech, not only lost her husband, but Mahlon and Chilion both die. Now, names in Hebrew meant something, and it's my understanding from research that Mahlon and Chilion, their names meant sickly and failing. Bad choice of the girls, too, right? So they die. So here's Mamane. Her husband has died. He's buried in this pagan land. Mahlon and Chilion have died. They're buried in this pagan land. And she's left with daughters-in-law to deal with. Ruth and Orpah. So what will she do? 3 women left to fend for themselves. But my friends, see, here's the deal. God had a plan. God has a plan for you. God is up to something. In the midst of your life seeming like you're at the bottom of the bottom of the bottom, can you imagine that's where Naomi was? She lost her husband and her boys, and she's stuck with these 2 girls that were pagans. But God was up to something. God had a plan, because Ruth is this fitting picture of every sinner born in a messed up culture. No matter how good she thought life was or how good Ruth was, Ruth could never be good enough. She found herself a slave of her circumstances, born into this mess. And here's the reality. Ruth was just like you and I. She could never hope in any way, shape, or form to redeem herself out of this mess. She needed a redeemer who would rescue her from the pit that she found herself in. She was a sinner in need of a Savior, a Redeemer. Can't we all relate, no matter how good life seems? Y'all ever been on those mountaintops? Life seems real good, and you turn the corner, valley. Right? And you go, man, that's not fair, God. Where was God in all this? God, why did this happen to me? God says, I have a plan. And it's not always mountaintops, and it's not always valleys, but I have a plan. And God had a plan for Ruth. God has a plan for us. Without Christ, every one of us are destitute. Without Christ, every one of us are spiritually bankrupt. And we're in need of a Redeemer to rescue us and to rescue us from the bondage of sin. Now watch God's wonderful, beautiful plan unfold for Ruth. Notice God's solution. God reaches Naomi, word reaches Naomi, I believe through God, that this drought had broken in Israel. This drought in Judah had broken, so now she has to take this move from over here about middle of the cross on the right, up around this Dead Sea, and cruise back over to Judah with 2 daughters-in-law. She didn't have the men to help this time. So Ruth has to make a hard decision. She had nothing where she was. She knew she needed to go back. She had no land, no possessions in Moab. Didn't even want to be there. She longed for her homeland, for her people. And Mama Nay, the Bible records, felt as if the Lord's hand was against her. Now, some might say she's having a pity party. Wouldn't you if you lost your husband and both your boys? I don't know if God's hand was against her as much as God's plan was for her. What do you think? So I think God's plan was for Naomi, and we're going to see what God is up to. She says, you know what, daughters-in-law, I'm going to release you to stay with your family. There's no sense in you coming back with me to Judah. We believe differently over here. We have a Jehovah God that we believe in. There's no sense in you staying. Just stay where you're at. Or no sense in you going, just stay where you're at. Why should they suffer if God's hand was against her? That was Mama Nay's thought. Why should these girls have to suffer? Because it seems like God's out to get me. Y'all ever felt that way? Well, Orpah decided she would stay, and after a few tears, she goes back to her family. And yet Naomi was left with Ruth. What will Ruth do? Well, it's recorded here in the book of Ruth, Ruth 1, verses 16 and 17. But Ruth said, this is that beautiful passage you hear at weddings. Ruth said, do not urge me to leave you, talking to Naomi, or turn back from following you. For where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. Thus may the Lord do to me, and worse, if anything but death parts you and me. Isn't that a beautiful, beautiful passage of commitment from Ruth to her mother-in-law Naomi? Let me just suggest that something went on in the life of Ruth. Through Naomi and her family, she learned about the one true God instead of this fake God, this idol, Chemosh. And God was using Naomi in the midst of her tragedy and her faithfulness to be a witness in this pagan culture made a lasting impression on this young lady Ruth, who was willing to leave her family and go now to a place she had never been, to the land of Judah, to worship the God that she had come to know. Ruth made a life-changing decision to stay with Naomi, but most importantly with Naomi's God. They arrive in Bethlehem, and everyone is glad to see Naomi back home. God's law provided in that time frame that if you were harvesting these crops, that anything that was left harvested as the harvester made the corner, or as the harvester was going along, if anything fell, they were to leave it. They were to leave the corners of the field. As if you were picking fruit, that they would leave some fruit hanging, and they would leave it there because God's law, you see the hand of God in this? See, God set this law in motion long before this event. God's law was leave it because there's always going to be poor. There's always going to be destitute. There's always going to be someone that needs something. Leave it, because then they can come along. And if they're willing to work for it, don't you wish that applied today? But that's a different story. If they were willing to work for it, they could go get it, and they would have grain. They would have barley. They would have fruit. God making his plan work even in the midst of this tragedy. So the remains of the harvest were gleaned by those willing to work. Ruth understands this situation. She knows Naomi is an older woman. She knows she has a responsibility to do some things. And so in Ruth chapter 2, verse 1, we see this. Now Naomi had a kinsman of her husband, a man of great wealth of the family of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. And Ruth the Moabitess said to Naomi, "Please let me go to the field and glean among the ears of grain, after one in whose sight I may find favor." And Naomi says, "Go, my daughter." Now watch this take place, because this is all happening quick here, right? She's already back in Judah, and now she's going to work to get some groceries because they're hungry. And the book of Ruth just happens to record that Naomi had a relative of her husband's, Elimelech's relative, was this dude named Boaz, a man of great wealth. And then scene 2, Naomi says, "I need to go glean from the field so we can get some groceries." And Naomi says, "Go ahead." And Ruth says, "Okay." Guess where Ruth ended up going to glean the fields from? Whose fields do you think Ruth went into? You know the story. This man Boaz, this relative of Elimelech. Boaz finds out that this beautiful girl out there working hard is Ruth, and he finds out that she's related to Naomi, and so he protects her. He says, "Hey, you stay in my fields only. I'm going to tell my servants to watch out for you. You can drink out of our canteen. You can have whatever we have, but I'm going to protect you because you are a relative of mine through your mother-in-law." We see the providential hand of God work. Watch this out. This is Ruth 2, verse 19. Her mother-in-law said to her after she came back, she told her everything's going down. I've been working, and this guy's been cool to me, and he's been taking care of me, and look what I brought, and he even sent this. And Naomi says, whoa, tell me, what's this dude's name? She says, Boaz. Boaz? Yeah, Boaz. Oh, my goodness. He's a relative of ours. That's Elimelech. That's my former husband's relative. This is amazing. Verse 19. Her mother-in-law then said to her, "Where did you glean today, and where did you work? May he who took notice of you be blessed." So she told her mother-in-law with whom she had worked. The name was a man with work today is Boaz. Naomi had a backflip. She said to her daughter-in-law, "May he be blessed of the Lord, who has not withdrawn his kindness to the living and to the dead." Again, Naomi said to her, "This man is our relative. He is one of our closest relatives." That's a word that we need to embrace. This word relative, this word redeemer, this word kinsman, okay? The providential hand of God is at work. By the way, there's no such thing as luck or fate in the land of believers, okay? You want luck, go to the casino. Actually, stay out of the casino and quit worrying about luck. Do you see what I mean? See, luck, it's like, "Oh, I sure am lucky." Man, if you're a child of God, it's not about being lucky. Well, fate had that in mind for me. Man, you're a child of God. He has a plan for you. He wants to prosper you. He wants to use you to redeem others. And God had a plan for Ruth. Naomi says, "This is our Gaal." This is the Hebrew word Gaal. He's our what? He's our Gaal. What does that mean? He's our kinsman redeemer come to rescue us. Sure enough, God was at work. And through a series of God-related events, Boaz would become Ruth's Gaal. Boaz would become Ruth's redeemer. He would redeem her from a life of poverty. He would redeem her from widowhood. He would pay the price so that she can have a new life again. We take it to chapter 4, verse 9. Then Boaz said to the elders of all the people, "You are witnesses today that I have bought from the hand of Naomi and all that belonged to Elimelech and all that belonged to Chilion and Mahlon Moreover, I have acquired Ruth the Moabitess, the widow of Mahlon, to be my wife, in order to raise up the name of the deceased on his inheritance, so that the name of the deceased will not be cut off from his brothers or from the court of his birthplace. You are witnesses today. Verse 13, so Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. And he went in to her, and the Lord enabled her to conceive, and she gave birth to a son. Then the women said to Naomi, blessed is the Lord who has not left you without a redeemer today. May his name become famous in Israel. May he also be to you a restorer of life and a sustainer of your old age for your daughter-in-law who loves you and is better to you than 7 sons. She's given birth to him. Now that was a very, very fast run through the book of Ruth, very fast pace, but I want you to see God's redemption in the process. Isn't that an amazing story? How Ruth from Moab, in a pagan culture, would be found by Naomi's son, then he would die, she would make a decision to go, and they would end up in Judah, and she would end up just happen to walk into the field of the guy named Boaz, who just happened to be related to Naomi, and then Boaz would just happen to think she's hot, and he would say, hey, I want to marry her. And then, do you see? Oh, well, that was just luck. That was just luck. That was good karma. My friends, it's the hand of God showing us a beautiful picture of the redemption that you and I need. Ruth's story is our story. She was reduced to complete poverty. She ended up as an outcast in a strange land. She worked like a slave, owing everything to the owner. And yet Boaz, the owner, stepped in and bought her freedom. She became his bride. They had a child named Obed. And Obed was the father of Jesse. And Jesse was the father of King David. Is that not heavy? Oh, it's just luck. No. God's plan to redeem his chosen people. God's plan to buy back every one of us that got separated from him in the garden when Adam sinned and brought sin into this world. God's plan in motion to set everything in place so that this lady at this time would meet this man at this time, and they would have children, and they would have children, and they would have children, and Jesus would come and be here on planet Earth and be born of a virgin, yet born through the line of David to fulfill what the prophet said were going to happen. That's not luck or fate, my friends. That's the hand of God doing everything he can to redeem you from your lostness and your sin. Oh, doesn't that make the hair stand up on your neck? It's so awesome. Our kinsman redeemer, Jesus, who comes to our rescue and buys us back from bondage and redeems us to give us life. And ultimately returns everything to us that was lost from sin. Oh, and it gets better. This Boaz, this kinsman redeemer that took Ruth as his bride, Jesus comes on scene. The great man of God, God himself, comes on scene and takes for himself what? The bride of Christ. We become his bride as he redeems us. Do you see that beautiful connect-the-dot picture that God put in place? We, the church, as the bride of Christ, enjoy a position of great favor, endowed with riches and privilege, and exalted as his bride forever and ever and ever. Oh, but there's one last thing, and we got to go. There's a testimony that's left. There's a testimony that must be revealed, and that's our testimony. Naomi had a relationship with God, but she thought, even in the midst, she thought the hand of God was against her, yet her testimony and her faithfulness to her God was a vital link in God's plan. Because of her witness, Ruth turned her back on paganism and worshiped the one true God. Then Ruth becomes a vital link in God's plan to raise her family in the kingdom of God, to someday be connected to Jesus. God's plan all along, my friends, was to incorporate you and I as Gentiles into his great kingdom. Here's how I know. Boaz was half Canaanite. He was the son of Rahab the prostitute that helped the spies at Jericho. Do you see the pieces connecting together? Rahab the prostitute had a son named Boaz, and this Boaz is the guy that came and redeemed Ruth, and then they had a son who had a son, and then they had David? Oh, my friends. Do you see the hand of God? If God will do that for them, what will he do for you? He's already done it in his son Jesus. Ruth the Moabitess, Boaz the half Canaanite, Jesus our Redeemer. You find in your bulletin. Well, let me get my bulletin here. I want you to look real quick, inside flap, as we'll be closed today. Look at the thought of the week. Every tiny bit of my life that has value I owe to the redemption of Jesus Christ. Am I doing anything to enable him to bring his redemption into evident reality in the lives of others? That's what Oswald Chambers asked. There's a testimony to be given to this faithfulness. My son and daughter-in-law are here today. They're going to have a baby July 16th, Lord willing. They're both a product of being raised in a Christian home. They're both a product of coming together by the providential hand of God. Who would know my son's belly and desire for food would go into Sweet and Sassy one day and meet that young lady. And they would eventually be married and now pregnant. And see, the requirement is now on them. We've given them our testimony. We've raised them in a Christian environment. And the challenge now is for them to raise this young daughter that's going to be born July 16, Gracelyn, in a Christian home, and to maintain that testimony and that witness so that Gracelyn not only comes up with the name or is raised up with the name Grace, but Gracelyn is learned to understand the grace of God because her parents have experienced the grace of God. What's your testimony? How are you raising your family? What will they turn out to be like because of you? I'm thankful for Naomi. I'm thankful for Ruth and Boaz. I'm thankful for Jesus. Stand with me. Father, thank you for your love for us. May we respond to